So unlike diamonds, crystals, or precious gemstones, all metals from iron and above, including silver, gold, platinum, and palladium, are only formed in supernova explosions or from the collisions of neutron stars. Although much of that material probably disappears into a black hole. So I got to think if there's some alternate universe out there where you have all this gold going into a black hole and popping out the other side into some other universe or some other place. You might have an alternate universe Scrooge McDuck who's like super very happy to have all of that gold in his possession. So because let's face it, if if the universe is as expansive and is infinite like we think it may be, then there would be an infinite number of Scrooge McDucks scattered around the multiverse, for example. So given the ancient Egyptian obsession with the stars and immortality, it's an important factor in understanding their obsession with gold. It certainly makes us wonder just how much they really knew about the origins of gold in the first place. At the very least, calling it the flesh of the gods would indicate that they were very well aware of gold and silver's celestial origins. And while many believers, or I should say many people believe we are somehow living in a new age which no longer has any use for gold and silver as money, I think this ill-founded sentiment is not actually a new idea at all. It's actually a very old idea. Human history, in fact, is littered with many brief periods where gold and silver standards of currency were abandoned in favor of a fiat currency, or fiat means by decree. Fiat meaning, well, we're going to use this money and it has value because the king says it has value. It's not really gold or silver or anything, but it has value, and the king's banks will back that up, right? But the problem with fiat currencies that really aren't based on anything other than promises is they eventually collapse, causing governments and populations to scramble back to a system of stable money which has stood the test of time. Lately, the past year, the price of silver has shot up. Gold's actually gone down a little bit as of this recording, but gold's still pretty high up there. So we find ourselves living in one of these brief and perilous periods today, in fact, a period where the money system is backed by nothing other than belief that it has value, rather than backing it up with real and actual value, something with historic value that has stood the test of time, like silver and gold. But why are we talking about money in the first place, when this is supposed to be a video series about Bioshock Infinite? I imagine I'm going to catch some hell in the comments, of course. The important point I want to make here is that everything that is old, such as the money used in 1912 in America, I think will someday be new again. Just as, and actually there's evidence for this becoming new again, and I'll explain why. Now, just as how Rosalind and Robert here are taking into account just how many times the coin that Booker flips will land on heads, we can expect the very same outcome when it comes to the use of fiat money versus gold and silver, or money that's backed by gold and silver. No matter how many times we think we are somehow in a different period in history, or we're more evolved than the people that came before us, right? Which is it's a huge intellectual trap. Now, sometimes that is true, but not always, right? There's this idea that, or there's this belief that people have that, well, people 100 years ago, they just on just about every level, maybe they just didn't know as much as we did. Wrong. There are you have to frame that in certain respects, like in exactly specifically, in what you have to define specifically what ways. You can't say across the board because that would be patently wrong. People ate better back at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. When food was available. Sometimes it wasn't. There were hard times. But people knew more about money. They knew more about relationships. When I say relationships, I mean they spent more time with each other, right? They may not have been as emotionally aware, especially after Jung and the great psychological transformations that started happening in the 60s, for example. But you can't paint a broad brush with folks that lived in 1912, for example. That's kind of the whole idea. So no matter how many times we think we're somehow in a different period, when and we're more evolved in every respect, I mean that's obviously wrong, as we all know. And when it comes to fiat currency, if you look at the history of every country that ever went off the silver or gold standard and in favor of a fiat currency that's really just based on promises, when you flip that coin and see how it lands, it always lands on heads, which means it always goes back to zero. A fiat currency starts at zero, and then it gains value, and then eventually, after enough time, it returns to zero. We're not in a different period where the dollar is just going to magically keep going and going and going. Over the hundreds of civilizations that have gone off precious metals and have decided, for whatever reason, to fund wars and to pay for expensive projects, they always return to zero, no matter what. And then people are left, as the currency returns to zero, people are left running back to silver and gold. Now, the only way people would have accepted the paper dollar in the first place is that the paper dollar had to be backed by gold, right? So this is a bill, $10 bill from 1922. And this, if you look at that, towards the bottom of that bill, it says $10 in gold coin, payable to the bearer on demand. That means you can go into a bank, plunk down your $10 note, and you will get an amount of $10 in gold from the bank. That's the only way you could get people to to use paper money, because back at the time of the period of Bioshock Infinite, people wouldn't have used paper money unless they were 100% confident that the banks would pay them in gold, because otherwise it's just worthless paper. They were much better educated about money in that way. So after post-World War II Europe and the United Kingdom were in ruins after the war, the United States emerged relatively unscathed. I mean, we had Pearl Harbor, but that was it. We weren't, our cities weren't burning. We were creating, the United States was actually creating weapons and supplies and selling it to Europe and to the United Kingdom, right? So we had, by the end of World War II, we find ourselves sitting on top of at least, if not more, half of the world's gold supply, right? So that's where we come into this very interesting situation where, as the war was beginning to wind down and it was looking like Hitler was definitely going to lose, something called the Bretton Woods Agreement was created by the Allied countries as a way to have an international standard of currency in the form of the dollar, which of course was backed by gold at that time. No one would have gone for this hadn't no one would have signed off on the Bretton Woods Agreement if they would have said, "Hey, we're going to do this thing. It's called the dollar. It's not backed by anything, but let's just." No one would have gone for it. So they backed it by gold, and of course that was a perfect opportunity for the United States because they were in the catbird seat, if you will. They were sitting pretty with all of this gold, and they thought, well, we can build upon this momentum by issuing the dollar as pretty much for the first time in world history that we know of, making the dollar the international standard. And so some countries didn't. Russia, one of them, was like, well, we don't really trust this idea because why does the United States get to do this, right? So Russia kind of bowed out of that. Some countries didn't trust the idea, like Russia. And by 1965, so we're talking about 20 years after the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar had already been in circulation for 20 years in the world, and a lot of countries were actually dependent upon it by then. But some are openly questioning the dollar because they thought, well, is the gold really there? How do we know, right? And so by 1965, Charles de Gaulle, who was the leader of France at the time, started demanding sending dollars back to America in exchange for gold. And other nations started to follow suit. Okay. And by 1971, so fast forward like 6 years later, the United States economy was beginning to feel the financial strain of paying for an ever-escalating war in Vietnam. Remember, the Vietnam War was going on, and wars are absolutely the most expensive thing for countries to pay for, obviously. And during times of war, that's when countries will actually switch to fiat currency. That's when they'll go, gosh, we got so much, we have so much gold leaving our vaults. We got to do something. So in 1971, there was a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of pressure to pay for the war, and also countries like France were still sending in massive amounts of dollars in exchange for their gold. They were getting their gold back. And so with them, this was basically, this precipitated a major economic catastrophe for the United States. So President Nixon at the time in 71 signed an executive order making the dollar a fiat or floating currency, no longer backed by gold. And that was in 1971. That was the Bretton Woods Agreement, was the international gold standard, and the domestic standard is something different. That happened before 1971. So this action, taking the dollar off of the gold standard in 1971, meant that the United States would keep the gold that it had left, making the dollar an instrument of debt backed by nothing more than the full faith and confidence of the United States government. But by that time, and the reason this worked is because by that time, when Nixon took the dollar off the international gold standard, the dollar had already become the standard de facto international currency for many nations. And so for the first time in recorded history, countless other nations had a vested interest in keeping the dollar afloat, right? So we had 20 plus years, 25 years after World War II of dollars going all around the world. And so after 25 years, a lot of nations were already using the dollar. So to take the dollar off the gold standard didn't hurt the United States as bad. It's starting to now, and it has been since then. The value of the dollar has gone down, but a lot of countries are already on the dollar. So it's like, well, what do you do? Do we all just fall together, or do we just keep this thing going? And that's where we're at today.